Dr. Koren, it's bad to spill the wine, right?
It certainly is, unless you spill it down your throat.
Yeah, that's good medical advice, right? Are we still thinking that wine's good for us, by the way, since we have a trained expert cardiologist here with us?
As we've talked about, Kevin, it's all about the dose.
Oh, okay.
So most things are good in the right dose. So that's always the question, is the right dose of wine.
So one glass of wine daily, too much, not enough.
That's pretty darn good.
Really, is that about right? I mean, we haven't crossed into the unhealthy stage.
One or two. The statistics are that if you're a complete non-drinker, you don't live as long as people who consume 1 or 2 glasses of wine on average.
Wow.
But people that consume 2 glasses of wine on average do better than people that consume 6 glasses of wine on average.
Right.
So it's all about the dose.
And it always makes us feel good to see the 108-year-old lady in Italy drinking red wine, right?
It certainly does, yeah.
Dr. Michael Koren is here with us. He's always a good sport, medical doctor, of course, with ENCORE Docs. And he spends a lot of time doing medical evidence, and doing clinical trials. And indeed, he helps host trials right here in St. Augustine at the Whetstone Building near Flagler Hospital. And we'll get into that in just a little bit. But today we're going to talk about diversity within medical trials and who's actually participating, right, Doctor?
It is. It's a hot button issue, as a matter of fact. In fact, the FDA is mandating that we look at diversity when we run clinical research. And there's something called the DEPICT Act that the FDA will now start to enforce. And what that will require is that people that run clinical trials will need to account for the background of the patients who are participating. And probably more importantly is the sponsors of research will need to have a diversity plan when they're actually constructing their clinical research trials.
Yeah. So are we to think that most clinical trial participants are white males or white males and females?
Well, historically, that's probably been the case. So historically, white males have been the predominant demographic of people who participate in clinical trials. But that's changed a lot. And there's a couple of ironies there, which we'll, I'm sure, get into during the course of our time together. Mm-hmm. But one of the reasons that white males were chosen was because they were considered the group of patients that would have the least likelihood of developing side effects. So you go back to phase 1 research where you're trying a drug in somebody who has not been exposed to that product before. And they would typically get white males from colleges who got paid some money, and they would go ahead and they would participate in trials. And the thought process is that because they can't get pregnant, we don't have to worry about that. Because they're kind of reproducible in terms of their physiology, we'll have more consistency and we'll get some information. So it kind of started with that. And then, of course, there were certain diseases that were the focal point of clinical research. So, for example, heart disease historically has been more prevalent, or at least more well recognized in men compared to women. And that was a focal point for research. And we would typically get the type of patients in the research trials that were indicative of the type of patients who would ultimately get the products down the road. Mm-hmm. But obviously, with the overall population of the United States becoming more diverse and just thinking in general becoming different, we're changing that dynamic. Mm-hmm. Now, the flip side of that is that if there were studies that had a particular high risk, or there was some ethical issue, they might choose a disadvantaged population. So the famous example of that is the Tuskegee study.
Right.
And remind everybody that it was a study that was sponsored by the U.S. government that went on for 40 years. And actually, it was a study where the natural history of syphilis was being evaluated by researchers who had good intentions. They just really wanted to understand what was going on with this particular disease. But what they did is that they withheld treatments to a group of African-American people in Tuskegee, Alabama, for literally 40 years.
Wow.
Which is just a horrible historical event, and has unfortunately had a legacy where there's mistrust of medical research.
Right, especially among African Americans.
Absolutely.
Right. So help us understand with other groups. So backing up just a little bit with women, for example, I guess there's not a necessarily hesitancy disproportionate for their gender. It's just that we just didn't really solicit their involvement early on.
I think that's part of it. Obviously, there's concerns about exposing women of childbearing potential to things that are new because of teratogenic effects or effects on fetuses. So that was a consideration. And then, as I mentioned, there were a lot of disease states where we just didn't think women were as likely to suffer from.
Yeah. So in doing all the work that you've done over the years in clinical research, have you ever had a moment where you said, wow, that's a really good thing that we had at least gender diversity on this because I learned something?
Oh, no question. Well, it happens all the time. So there are certain areas where gender diversity or racial diversity or other types of diversity are actually really, really important. So I'm a cardiologist. One of the things that really comes to mind is the way we treat congestive heart failure.
Mm-hmm.
So we know, for example, that African Americans are more likely to suffer consequences of congestive heart failure compared to non-African American populations, and that they actually respond differently to medications than Caucasian patients. And that was through research that was done in ultimately diverse populations. And there was actually studies that were done in exclusively African American populations showing that the effects that we saw in the diverse population actually translated specifically to African Americans. And that's because the factors that drive heart failure in African Americans are often different than what drive heart failure in Caucasian patients. So African Americans are more likely to develop heart failure related to hypertensive complications, and white patients are more likely to derive congestive heart failure from heart attacks. So it's a fundamental difference and something that we've learned over the years. Obviously, for hormonal therapies, we've learned quite a bit, and those would be gender differences. In the old days, we were actually giving estrogen to men to see whether or not that helped their cholesterol problem.
Okay.
And the concept there was, well, women are less likely to have cholesterol problems and they're less likely to have heart disease. Maybe the difference is estrogen. So they gave men estrogen, which didn't work, and they stopped giving women estrogen, actually, because it also doesn't work for heart disease. So that's not the issue. Obviously, estrogen has other effects in women for postmenopausal symptoms, but we actually stopped giving that for preventing heart disease. But it was only through gender diversity and actually giving men estrogen that we kind of figured that out.
And speaking of hypertension, that's one of the trials that you're doing, right?
We are. Hypertension has been a core area of focus for us for a number of years. And we are, as we speak, doing studies where we're looking for patients with hypertension. And if you have hypertension and changes in your heart muscle structure, we're particularly interested in your situation.
Yeah. It's Dr. Michael Koren once again. We're also overall today talking about diversity in clinical trials and the history and moving forward. So despite what happened with the Tuskegee studies, are we better today in terms of having diverse participation in clinical trials, or are we just still not doing very well?
We're actually doing much better. We're doing much, much better. So just to address the diversity issue, the Tuskegee situation was a horrible situation, and what I'd like to reassure everybody is that has been addressed thoroughly, and there were changes in the way we did things in the 70s that were a reflection of acknowledging those past misdeeds and moving forward. So there's a very important paper that was put out by the U.S. government that has been embraced by industry and everybody else involved in clinical trial world called the Belmont Report. And that came out in 1979. And it was a reflection of something called the National Research Act, which was passed by Congress in 1974, where they basically said, you got to clean up your act in clinical research. So at that point, anything that had any type of racial prejudice to it or anything that disadvantaged certain groups in research was completely barred. And the ethical structure for modern research was set by the Belmont Report. So keep in mind that from something from 1979 that has been thoroughly embraced at this point is something that's over 40 years old. So there's been a generation or two of people, including myself, that have grown up in this era where we will not tolerate any unethical practice, certainly no unethical practices that involve diversity or disadvantaging certain groups of patients. So I think that's important for everybody to realize is that we're well into the era where treating people with respect across all different demographics is extremely fundamental in terms of what we do.
So interesting, in other countries, they sort of handle this diversity of participation in clinical trials with different approaches, right?
Yeah, it's really interesting, and I think it's under-recognized here. So despite the great progress, in my opinion, that we've made in terms of diversity and reaching out to underserved populations and communities, there seems to be a hyper-awareness of racial issues these days in the United States. And that's one strategy to try to continue to address issues of inequity and basically different types of performances amongst different groups in the United States. So that's one strategy. But not every country has taken that strategy. So if you go to France, for example, in France, it's actually against the law to collect data on the racial background of people. So, in the United States, you have all these voter registration drives and whatnot, and they ask you, what's your race? And in France, that's considered not only illegal, but like, why would you do that? Like, we're all French. So if the concept here is that we want to be united and that we're all the same country and we're all citizens of the same country, why do you even ask the question? And so that's the other side of the diversity argument, is that when you're constantly reinforcing differences, even though your intentions may be good to look for a representative group of people in any particular process, there's also the flip side, which is it can actually create separations based on the fact that you're always looking at differences rather than similarities. Now, the flip side to that would be a place like Lebanon. So in Lebanon, as most people might probably have gleaned, is that you have a Christian population and a Muslim population, and the two have not always got along that well. So their way of resolving that is by being very explicit, by making sure that you have equal representation in governmental things. So they actually, when they create their presidency, one year it'll be a Muslim person, next year it'll be a Christian person, and then in their House of Representatives or their equivalent of that, there's this balance. And everything about Lebanese rule is based on creating this balance. So that's another way of approaching this issue, but that would be in a way, I would argue, where you have two groups that want to create some sort of equality and not let one develop a hegemony over the other or control over the other.
And you don't want to get into a situation where it encroaches on the science, right?
Well, exactly. So now getting into the scientific issues is something else. So scientifically, we started to talk about some things that are different between different groups of people, and you need to acknowledge that when you're running clinical trials. So there may be, for example, in hypertension, mechanisms by which one group would be advantaged and another group may not be as much advantage. I'll give you an example of that. A very common type of medication that's used for patients with hypertension is called an ACE inhibitor or an angiotensin receptor blocker. And those drugs block a specific type of hormone that has a deleterious effect, and it's called angiotensin 2. So angiotensin 2 is a bad actor and causes all kinds of problems. And we have drugs that block that well. But that's less important for African American patients. In African American patients, they often have issues that are related to their fluid volume and related to kidney function. So in general, African American patients respond better to diuretics, whereas Caucasian patients respond better to things that block this bad hormone system. So it's a fundamental difference in what drives blood pressure problems in different groups. Now, having said that, there may be some African American patients that have angiotensin 2 problems, and there are certainly many white patients that have problems with volume. So it's not universal, but it's a trend. And this gets into another whole discussion, the difference between profiling and prejudice. So sometimes profiling actually helps us make better decisions, but that can also deteriorate to a level where it just becomes a bias.
That's Dr. Michael Koren. Once again, he's with ENCORE Docs, and of course they have offices right here in St. Johns County and St. Augustine at the Whetstone Building. They have trials going on, too, that you could participate in. We'll get into a list of those here in just a moment. But if you have any questions and you're leaving us for whatever reason, you can always call 904-730-0166 or go to EncoreDocs.com. That's EncoreDocs.com. So, Dr. Michael Koren, have you ever seen the Rolling Stones in concert?
I have more than once.
Oh, yeah?
More than once. Yeah.
What was your favorite experience of seeing the Stones live?
So I saw the Stones live for the first time at Madison Square Garden, I want to say 1975 or 6. Okay. 76, I think it was. And it was pretty wild. I don't know why this happened, but I remember this, is that people were throwing firecrackers around in Madison Square Garden.
Seems safe.
And Mick Jagger actually had to reprimand the audience for that. He said, my British accent is probably not working right now, but he basically said, some guy got his ass blown up by a firecracker last night, so I'd advise not to send them.
Don't send like any more up there. Yeah. Now concerts feature gunfire. Things have changed a little bit, right?
Yeah, so I don't know exactly why that happened, but that was my first experience. And I went to the Stones when they came to Jacksonville recently, which was fun.
Yeah. How did they compare to what they were like in 1970-something, 75?
I'll tell you what, Jagger is moving just as well now as he did back then.
Isn't that amazing?
He's probably a little more sober now than he was then. But
yeah. What was the heart procedure he had done recently?
He had a TAVR procedure, which is a aortic valve replacement. Which is amazing that he when he was supposed to come to Jacksonville, was originally canceled because of his heart procedure, and then he came back, a few months later, and boom, he was out on stage dancing for 3 hours.
Yeah. You surprised by that as a cardiologist?
I was saying, who's that guy? But he moves like Jagger.
Yeah, yeah, that's right. That'd be a good song, right?
Yeah.
That's Dr. Michael Koren. He's always a good sport and with us. He is with, of course, ENCORE Docs, and they're doing clinical trials here in St. Augustine. We're talking about diversity in clinical trials. Let's start out first talking about the trials that you have ongoing here in St. Augustine that you're recruiting for.
Sure. Well, thank you for asking. So we have a wonderful group of physicians here in St. Augustine who work with us across many different specialties. I'm a cardiologist, and some of my cardiology colleagues are working with us, but we have gastroenterologists and internists and surgeons and others who are all part of this network of physicians who run clinical trials. And one of our areas of focus right now is congestive heart failure. Mm-hmm. So we have some really, really neat programs that are looking at ways of diagnosing congestive heart failure in a more effective way. Mm-hmm. So as people may or may not know, when you get diagnosed with congestive heart failure, more likely than not, it's a lifetime diagnosis. Mm-hmm. And it can be controlled and monitored, and a lot of people with that diagnosis do well for years and years and years and years. But there is a group of patients that tends to have a deterioration of their status over time. And we find that if we use certain technologies and certain drugs, we can prevent those people from deteriorating, getting sick, and ending up back in the hospital. And one of the elements of this is to see whether or not we can take subtle clues and use those clues to keep people out of trouble. So one of the simplest things that we do that we've talked about for years and years and years is just weigh patients every day. So when you put somebody on a scale every day, even though your weight may change, if you're developing extra fluid in your system or a fluid overloaded state, your weight will go up faster than it might ordinarily. So a typical warning sign in a congestive heart failure patient would be that their weight goes up 5 pounds over a period of 3 days, and that's because of fluid accumulation for whatever reasons. Maybe they're eating more salt, or their medicines become ineffective, or they have an arrhythmia, or what have you. But that is the sign. And so that's one way for patients to monitor. So over the years, there have been different strategies to look at that. But the weight is imperfect because people might eat more or less, and that can affect their weight. Or they can take different levels of diuretics that can affect their weight, or other things, or their diabetes is getting out of control. So people are looking at other measures of trying to understand that. And one of the measures that we're working at now is fascinating. And basically, it takes using an app on your phone and just talking to your phone. So how would that work, you might ask? Well, it turns out that just your voice pattern, the number of words per breath, the number of words per sentence, how you enunciate, the tone of your voice are all things that are trackable and change when your respiratory status changes. Right. And they may be very early subtle signs. Now, a physician can't really assess that very well, but that's what computers are good at. Mm-hmm. So what this basic program is looking at is having a person with a diagnosis of congestive heart failure start to talk to their phone when they're in a stable state, mm-hmm. and then monitor them over time. And if something changes, then getting that person medical attention to see if that change is associated with possible worsening of their condition, but most importantly, intervening before that subtle change becomes a more important, serious change that leads to hospitalization.
So that's a clinical trial that people could participate in. Because I know a lot of us would think clinical trial always is going to involve putting some sort of pill in our mouth or taking some sort of shot. No. But that's not what this is at all. Just
medical testing a medical hypothesis. So in this case, we're testing the hypothesis that we can create a computer app that looks at human voice over time and can diagnose when people are getting into trouble with congestive heart failure. And if you have a history of congestive heart failure, give us a call and we'll get you involved. You don't have to stick anything in your body.
Wow. And of course, if they do get involved, they get the benefit of very aggressive and regular health screening monitoring, right? Some people may only go see a doctor on an infrequent basis. If you participate in a clinical trial with ENCORE Docs, you're going to get on, regular health screenings.
Absolutely. Well, the most important value proposition for the patients is we're going to try to keep you out of the hospital. So just being part of the study, there's a good chance you're going to stay out of the hospital. You'll get a lot of education. You'll get your meds looked at very, very carefully. We'll make sure that you're on the state-of-the-art regimen. There's a little payment for people that participate in the study. And you have a fun group of people to get to know and to work with. And we'll be looking out for you.
Yeah, and you could find yourself on the cutting edge of progress.
Absolutely. Yeah. You can say, tell your grandkids that, hey, that app that you're talking into now, I helped develop it for this purpose.
Wow. Good stuff. If you have any questions about that, or you know somebody who may be interested in that particular study, get in touch with ENCORE Docs here in St. Augustine and St. Johns County. Go to EncoreDocs.com, ENCORE Docs, EncoreDocs.com. You can also call 904-730-0166, and we'll give out that phone number a couple more times here over the next 20 minutes or so. Maybe another example of another trial that you're doing here in St. Augustine.
So the other space that we're very active in is called the liquid biopsy space. Mm-hmm. So cancer, of course, is something that we've made great progress on, but it's still a huge problem for the American population. And we all know that diagnosing cancer early is very, very important. So if you diagnose cancer in late stages, then often there's not a whole lot you can do about it. But if you diagnose it early, often you can cure it completely. So the question is, well, how do you diagnose it early? So our strategies have been a number of screening tests. So for example, if you are screening for colon cancer, historically, you would take your stool and you would measure to see if there's any blood in the stool, and you do that periodically, and you would see whether or not there is evidence of blood. And if there is, one of the possibilities, but certainly not the only possibility, is that you have a colon cancer. Of course, it could be gastritis, or you might have had 10 glasses of wine that night instead of my recommended 2, or it could have been a number of things, but it was a screening test.
Right.
And then we have screening tests for cancer where you get CAT scans. I know some of the hospitals have been talking about CAT scans looking for lung cancers, particularly in people that are at risk, say smokers, and those, there's some value to that, but you can't get that every day, and you certainly don't even want to get that every year because of the radiation risk. So there's some downsides to that. So people, now that we understand genetics better, are saying, well, we are able to look at molecular signals at extremely low levels. So wouldn't it be cool if we just did a blood test that told us, A, we're worried about cancer, and B, based on the genetic profile in the blood, what that cancer is. So as we speak, we are doing studies looking at liquid biopsies for a number of different purposes. Most commonly, they're colon cancer studies. So for example, if you're being screened with a colonoscopy to evaluate a possibility of cancer, we can get you involved in a program.
Very good. Well, once again, if you have any questions, go to EncoreDocs.com. That's EncoreDocs.com. And these are trials that are being undertaken here in St. Augustine, so it's incredibly convenient. We encourage you to reach out and learn more. On 103.9 WSOS, streaming online at staugustineradios.com and PanaVidraRadio.com, and also via the TuneIn app that you can download on your phone or on your tablet or whatever, and listen to us anywhere in the world. We're spending time with Dr. Michael Koren. He, of course, is with us. He's a medical researcher. He's also a cardiologist, a medical doctor, and he is with ENCORE Docs. Learn more by going to EncoreDocs.com. They have offices throughout Northeast Florida, including right here in St. Augustine in the Whetstone Building near Flagler Hospital, and they are doing trials right now, clinical trials that you may be able to participate in. And one of those, I guess, has to do with cholesterol issues, right?
Yeah, we're running a number of cholesterol projects as we speak, and we have quite a reputation, I would say, around the world as being a leader in cholesterol studies. And here in our St. Augustine office, where we're actually looking at specific new products for treating different cholesterol issues, including lipoprotein (a), which we've talked about before, which is the really, 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 really bad cholesterol, and LDL, which is the standard bad cholesterol that we talk about, and using strategies that are beyond statins. So we're excited about that.
People that are driving around right now, what's your gut tell you the percentage of people that have a cholesterol problem?
At least 25% of the U.S. population has a cholesterol problem, at least. Wow. And certainly it's one of those risk factors that makes a huge difference in somebody who's been diagnosed with cardiovascular disease. So if you've had a heart attack or a stroke or angina, or you have blockages in your leg arteries, we know that lowering your cholesterol is one of the most effective strategies that we have to prevent further complications.
Yeah. That's Dr. Michael Koren. Once again, we're talking about various clinical trials that are available for you to participate in here in St. Augustine. So talk to me a little bit more about what you're doing in the area of cholesterol and lipids and all that.
Sure. So given the fact that we're talking about diversity today as well, I'll kind of tie it into that. So there are certain disease states, as I mentioned, for example, heart failure, where there's a pretty significant difference in terms of strategy based on the background, the racial background of the patients that you're treating. But the truth is, in cholesterol, it doesn't really matter. Blacks and whites and women and men, everybody responds pretty similarly to cholesterol medications, and they all pretty much benefit from cholesterol medications. Now, it's true that the prevalence of disease may be a little bit different. So, for example, I mentioned lipoprotein (a), which is this particular genetic form of dyslipidemia or high cholesterol that's very devastating in some families. And that tends to run a little bit more commonly in Black compared to white populations. But the fact is that once you've been given this diagnosis, your prognosis is similar despite your racial background. And so once you made the diagnosis, the treatment is going to be the same in the different racial groups. And in the clinical trials, as you know, we're looking at treatment options often. So while there are certain differences in treatment response, there are many times when there are not differences. And, I can certainly share a few anecdotes on that.
Yeah. Well, please do.
Sure. So I think I've mentioned this maybe in past segments, but one of my favorite stories was being part of a panel that was looking at this large cholesterol study. And it was a study that involved, as I recall, like 30,000 people. So we do these studies. We're blinded. We don't know as investigators how things are going, but there's a committee that's unblinded. And when the committee looks at the data, if they see a big effect one way or another, they're going to stop the study. So let's say you have 30,000 people, and you notice that the people who were getting the product that was being used to treat cholesterol had 100 deaths versus 200 deaths in the group that did not get the product. It's a huge difference. 200 in the placebo group, 100 in the treated group. So that means that the product is reducing heart disease deaths by 50%.
Right.
So how long do you go with that knowledge without telling the world about it? It's an ethical dilemma. On one hand, we want to get the information, and we want to get as much information as possible. And once we tell everybody about it, the study becomes unblinded, and its ability to scientifically prove things becomes limited. But on the other hand, how can you not tell people about such a huge treatment effect?
Right.
So we had this situation where there was a product that had a very nice treatment effect, and then they started breaking it down. So men tend to have more heart attacks than women. And because of that, the difference in men in terms of the absolute numbers was greater than the difference in women. So let's say of those 200 people on the placebo arm that had heart attacks, 150 were men and only 50 were women. So because there were smaller numbers of women that actually had the heart attack in the placebo group, it was harder to prove that the drug worked specifically in women. Just a numbers game.
Right.
So there was a woman cardiologist who was reviewing the data and said, well, I really don't like the way this trial was done because you should have kept on going. You should have, why did you stop? You should have proven definitively that this also works in women. I mean, we need diversity. You need to prove that it works in women. So I thought about it for a second. I said, well, I can see your point of view, but think about it this way. How many men have to die to prove that women are also human beings?
Right.
And so you can flip these things and think about it. So in the cholesterol space, women respond very similar to men, and women happen to be human beings.
Yeah. We started out talking a little bit about this, Dr. Koren, but overall there is a push, right, to make sure that clinical trials feature diversity, that have diverse populations engaged in them, right?
Yeah, there is. So there's something called the DEPICT Act, which is a mandate for the FDA. It was passed by Congress, and the FDA is on board. And what's happening now is that companies need to have a diversity plan when they run any particular type of clinical trial. And there is a push to make sure that there's a racial and demographic balance in the trials that we perform. So an example of that was the COVID-19 studies. And we started out of the box, this remarkable effort that was able to create a vaccine 66 days after we identified the genetics of the virus, which is still mind-boggling when I think about it. But the first people that were willing to jump in tended to be actually more affluent, more educated white people. Because they had read about it and they wanted to be on board and they wanted to protect themselves as much as possible. And there was reluctance in certain other communities, not just racial, but there was a group of black people that were very skeptical about it. There was a group of evangelical people that were very skeptical about it, and others that were more vaccine skeptic. So in the early parts of the trial, when you looked at the demographics, it was predominantly white. In fact, in the first 10,000 patients, 97% were white. And so there was a little bit of concern about that, and myself and other investigators wanted to change those numbers a little bit. So we went out to the African-American community, did a bunch of different programs. I reached out to a number of African-American physicians and different support groups that were predominantly African-American, and we made a difference. So by the end of the trials, we got up to between 9 and 10% African-American participation in the COVID-19 trials with Moderna and with Pfizer based on this outreach and push. And it turns out the vaccines work equally well in blacks and whites. So we have the data now to support that concept. So, I'm glad we did it. But it took an effort, and the DEPICT Act is now sort of formalizing that. That type of process needs to be part of the thinking when we run any clinical trial.
Is it your sense that that may be consistent with other viruses that we may try to inoculate ourselves from? In other words, like for the flu vaccine, do we know that it works pretty evenly with all races and genders?
It does. In general, infectious diseases have pretty similar effects in most populations, and vaccines elicit an immune response, which is the same pretty much in all different groups. And that immune response is what protects us. And generally, the immune responses more or less protect people equally well. Right. So that gets into another, again, flip side of things, is that while it's important to recognize diversity, and I've certainly shown you examples where diversity is really important in terms of understanding how to treat people, you don't want that to slow things down. Because if it does slow things down, then they're all lives that are being put at risk.
Right.
So there's, like many other things in life, there needs to be a good balance.
Yeah. And slowing things down could happen if for some reason we put the brakes on clinical research because we're trying to reach some sort of diversity goal.
Correct. Yeah. And that's the whole argument of quotas versus good intentions.
Yeah.
So, certainly I'm a huge believer in clinical trials, of course, and I can tell you zillions of examples of patients who have had very tangible benefits for participating in clinical trials. And that benefit should be for everybody.
Sure.
We don't want one group to get that disproportionate benefit. So there's a fairness element to why we talk about this. We don't want anybody to feel that they should be excluded from a clinical trial.
Yeah. What's your sense of how, especially in the African-American community, you have to get over the Tuskegee example? I mean, that becomes part of lore. And of course, we know that, folklore is something that can hang with us for centuries, right?
Yeah. My typical response to that is you can either talk about the Tuskegee experiment or talk about the Tuskegee Airmen.
Yeah.
So one is something that separates us. The other is this incredible heroic story that brings us together. So a lot of this is perspective and positioning and framing. And as I mentioned, Tuskegee experiment was horrible, but we've addressed it. We've put things in place that prevent that from happening again. And that should not prevent people from getting the benefit of clinical research, which is quite large.
Yeah. You see any hopeful signs that younger African Americans are less skeptical?
I do. I had a great interaction literally this week. Lovely African American woman who wanted to do the clinical trial specifically to show that this was a good thing for African Americans to do, and it was heartwarming to see that, and she was tremendous.
Once again, that's the voice of Dr. Michael Koren. Of course, he's with ENCORE Docs. He's a medical doctor, researcher, and cardiologist, and he also works with individuals who are participating in clinical trials right here in St. Johns County and St. Augustine. You can learn more by going to EncoreDocs.com. That's EN, ENCORE Docs. spell it EN, EncoreDocs.com. Call 730-0166 with any questions. Before we let you go, Dr. Koren, any closing thoughts?
Well, again, I am a true believer in clinical research, and my passion and mission is to get as many people involved as possible. Probably at best, 1% of the country has participated in clinical research. Only about half of the people in the country know about clinical research. And interestingly is that when somebody gets over the barrier of getting that first study experience, they become a fan. They become a groupie almost. And it's so fascinating that once you participate in clinical research, the likelihood of volunteering for a second study, or at least willing to volunteer for a second study, is 99%.
Wow.
So that is a patient satisfaction rate that's really phenomenal. So it's kind of strange when people first hear about it. They're worried about being a guinea pig and they're worried about the unknown. But the actual process these days is pretty amazing. It's a free process. You don't have to even give your insurance information. We keep your information confidential. You work with amazing people. There's a huge focus on who you are as an individual and making sure that we understand you and your particular needs. And then ultimately, you're part of this worldwide effort to make things better for the health of people around the world. Yeah. So it's a pretty cool process.
I think most of us, too, if we think to people that we've known who have participated in clinical trials, I don't know of anyone who's ever said, well, I'll never do that again, right? Which speaks to your 99% number, right?
And I'll share with you one last anecdote. I know you asked me to give you a summary, but I'll go into one last anecdote because it's really interesting about the worldwide nature of things. So we're working on a study with a British company on this lipoprotein little a problem that we've talked about several times. and we're in some early phase work with this company. So they're being very, very careful to make sure that the patients who are involved are stable patients. So there was a patient that we recommended for the study, and the medical director from the study from the UK said, I think this patient is a little bit unstable. And I was surprised. They sent that email back, and I couldn't understand why. And then we asked the question, and they said that, well, this patient had a lab test come back called a CRP, which is called C-reactive protein, and it's a sign of inflammation. And the doctor was worried that this patient had a higher level of CRP than what was normal, that he considered normal, and thought that that patient may have some inflammation somewhere and wasn't a good phase 1 patient. Well, it turned out that the patient was African American, and it turns out that African Americans have a higher level of this CRP than Caucasians. Now, as a UK physician, he probably didn't know that. And I brought that to his attention, and he was so thankful that I educated him on that. We got the patient involved, and the patient participated in a clinical trial. But again, it was an informational exchange where somebody like me, who's dealt with people of different backgrounds in my demographic, was able to educate somebody in the UK that was involved in worldwide drug development.
Wow.
So your impact here as a local person can actually change the world.
Yeah, quite literally, right? You can easily see that path. Very good. If you have any questions about how you could participate, once again, go to the website encoredocs.com. That's encoredocs.com. Dr. Michael Koren, thank you very much for coming by. We appreciate you.
Always a pleasure. Thank you.